All right. Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you all, and thanks to Michelle for inviting me to speak. My name is Taylor, and I'm a corporate engagement manager at Greener by Default. And today I'll be discussing how event organizers can reduce the carbon footprint of their meals through simple behavioral science techniques. And before I dive in, I'll just share a little bit about my background. So I have been in the corporate sustainability field for a little over 7 years now. I started out working with the San Francisco Department of the Environment, helping local organizations become Green Business certified. And I've also worked at GreenBiz, which is now called Trellis, for 6 years creating events for corporate sustainability professionals. And really, throughout my career, I've been passionate about using food to reduce our collective environmental impact. So I'm really excited to share our strategies with y'all. And I hope by the end of this presentation, you'll have a few new tools and tips to make your event meals more sustainable. Okay, so to start, I'll just share who GBD is and what we do. We are a nonprofit that empowers institutions with evidence-based consulting and hands-on guidance to serve inclusive, sustainable, and delicious plant-forward menus. And we do all of that while maintaining diners' freedom of choice to eat meat and dairy. Now, there are a number of challenges that we are working to solve with event organizers by serving more plant-forward menus. This includes the increasing expectation from attendees for meaningful action on climate change and healthy food. There was a recent Promo Leaf survey of event attendees conducted by Censuswide that found that 85% of respondents prefer or strongly prefer attending conferences with sustainable practices. In addition, there was another study from LEK Consulting of almost 1,600 consumers that found that 63% of consumers try to eat healthy most or all of the time. And in addition, serving healthy food at events, can also be important for keeping attendees energized and engaged for long conference days. No one wants to feel sluggish after a meal and still have, 5 more sessions to go to. One of the reasons why plant-forward menus are a great solution to these challenges is because they're an easy way to cut carbon emissions. Studies show that on average, plant-based meals can produce half the carbon emissions of animal-based meals. And this is due to the large amount of land required to raise and feed animals, the methane gases that they produce, and the deforestation associated with creating grazing land and feed crops. Take the Impossible Burger, for example, which produces 89% less emissions than a typical beef burger. Also, when it comes to reducing emissions, data shows that serving more plant-based food can be much more effective than other sustainability initiatives, such as reducing or eliminating single-use plastic, though, of course, those practices are important for other environmental and social reasons, of course. And you can see from this chart that switching from beef to veggie on the left results in almost a 400% larger decrease in carbon compared to the zero waste initiatives on the right. And for a lot of organizations, these stats are surprising because, we have been focusing as a society for so long on how food is served rather than what food is served, even though the what is by far the bigger source of emissions. And one of the reasons why people have avoided focusing on what food is served is because food is such a deeply personal and emotional topic. However, the standard American diet with meat and dairy in every dish is actually not, a very inclusive way to serve food. Serving plant-forward menus can be more inclusive of the 30 to 50 million Americans who are lactose intolerant, the majority of whom are people of color, of Buddhists, Hindus, Rastafarians, and other religious populations who either may be vegetarian or don't eat certain animal products, and is also more inclusive of the more than half of all Americans who are trying to eat less red meat, and the more than one-third who are trying to eat more plant-based foods. And lastly, it's more inclusive of communities of color who are 3 times more likely to identify as vegetarian. Also, the truth is that vegan food, is not just appealing to vegans. The majority of Americans are happy to eat plant-based as long as it tastes good and is filling. And this is oftentimes where event organizers run into problems because, they will oftentimes think of plant-based meals as only being strictly for vegans and vegetarians. So that usually for an event, they'll only end up ordering a small percentage of plant-based food, and typically they'll also place it, on a separate table. Those practices, however, can discourage diners from taking the plant-based options and continues to perpetuate this misconception that vegan food is just for vegans. So the bottom line is that plant-forward menus can really be a great solution for event organizers. They can help meet their carbon reduction commitments, oftentimes at a fraction of the cost compared to other sustainability initiatives, such as purchasing carbon offsets or switching to all electric signage. They can also help meet attendees' health expectations and improve their engagement while providing options for everyone at the table. And all these benefits in turn can help attract and retain attendees by meeting the needs of younger generations. Okay, now I'll share how GBD helps event organizers create more plant-forward menus and achieve these benefits. So these are our top strategies, including plant-based defaults, climate-friendly ratios, subtle substitutions, prime placement, tasty titles, and meat reduction. I'll now walk you through each of them in the next few slides and provide examples of how we can apply them to event menus. So the first strategy is plant-based defaults, and this is one of our most effective strategies. And the core concept of it is to serve a plant-based meal by default and give diners the choice to opt into meat and dairy. And the reason we focus so much on this strategy, hence our name, Greener by Default, is because studies show that people are more than 7 times more likely to order a plant-based meal from a menu that's plant-based by default compared to a traditional menu. And there's also a lot of different food service environments where we can apply this strategy to. So for example, if people are RSVPing to an event, it can be a really clean switch. You would just state in the registration form that, in alignment with your commitment to inclusivity, sustainability, that you're serving a plant-based meal by default, and then you would give attendees a box to check if they want to stick with the default or opt into a meat meal instead. Another example would be if food is served buffet or family style, you would just want to make sure that the base of the buffet meal is plant-based and place it first with the meat and dairy toppings at the end of the line. So for example, for a build your own fajita bowl buffet, you can make the base Mexican rice with some grilled veggies mixed in and then place the meat and dairy toppings towards the end. And then lastly, if people are choosing from a menu, like at a food truck, you can make the base of the dishes plant-based and offer meat and dairy as add-ons, ideally at an extra charge. So for instance, for a poke bowl at a food truck, you can make the base maybe rice with pickled veggies and crispy tofu, and then you can offer chicken as an add-on for, say, $4. All right, the next strategy is called climate-friendly ratios, which we recommend using when it's not possible to serve a plant-based meal by default. It's generally our second most effective strategy, and what it does is it recommends offering at least 2 plant-based options for every animal-based option. There was a recent study that found that when menus shift from 2/3 meat options to 2/3 veg options, selection of the veg meals can increase by more than 50%. And the reason we find that this is true is because, usually when there's only one vegan option in a buffet, for example, omnivores will oftentimes perceive it as, the special option that's really just there for vegans and vegetarians. Once we shift the ratios, however, and we provide a plethora of plant-based options, we can then normalize eating plant-based and shift the decision-making process. Then people are more likely to make their decision based on things like sight and smell, rather than whether they identify as vegan or vegetarian. Subtle substitutions is another easy and effective strategy, and this one focuses on serving plant-based condiments, milks, desserts, and breads by default. And this can be a really great way to ensure that your menu is inclusive because it meets the needs of those with allergies and dietary restrictions who otherwise might be left without creamer for their coffee or butter for their bread, for example. Plus, nowadays, plant-based alternatives are so good that people usually don't notice the difference, and they can also be cheaper and, of course, more sustainable than animal-based products. One example is there was a school district in Colorado that we worked with, and they replaced the eggs and milk in all of their baked goods with plant-based ingredients such as oil, applesauce, and flax seeds. And by doing that, they were able to save more than $10,000 annually and as much carbon as driving over 50,000 miles. And the last thing I want to mention on this strategy before we move on is that considering, the current rise of avian flu and other animal-derived viruses right now, this can be an especially cost-effective and beneficial strategy since, these types of viruses can cause huge fluctuations in the cost and availability of eggs and other animal-based products. The next strategy is prime placement, which recommends placing plant-based options first in buffet lines and on menus. There was a study from the World Resources Institute that found that placing plant-based dishes first on the main menu can increase selection of plant-based options by more than 50%. It's also important to not, as we've talked about earlier, to not separate the plant-based options from the rest of the food. Usually, when there's a main menu and a separate vegan menu or a vegan table, omnivores tend to think, again, I'm not vegan, so I'll just stick with the normal menu and don't even consider the plant-based options. But when they're on the main menu or the main buffet table, attendees are more likely to choose it without even considering the fact that it's plant-based. All right, the second to last strategy is tasty titles, and this one focuses on labeling foods with descriptors that focus on flavors and ingredients rather than using terms like vegan, meatless, or healthy. And the idea behind this is that people generally don't want to be reminded of what they are missing out on by using those types of terms. And some people also just unfortunately associate vegan food with food that's tasteless and boring, even though we all know that that's not the case. So, for example, while many people might not want to eat a meatless or a vegan pasta, they are much more likely to want to eat a rosemary lemon chickpea pasta. The World Resources Institute found that making this type of title change can increase sales of an item by 76%. And we also worked with a software company, and after seeing this presentation, they decided to change the name of what was once called their vegetarian hummus wrap to a roasted red pepper avocado hummus wrap, and sales immediately increased. And although we don't recommend including vegan in the title, we of course recognize it's still important to share dietary information with diners. So we do recommend including at least a small V in parentheses at the end or a leaf so that people who want to make sure it's vegan for dietary reasons can confirm that that's the case. All right, and then this is the final strategy, which is meat reduction. And this one really works well in tandem with the others. And it focuses on reducing the portion size of meat in dishes that do contain animal protein. So this can be as simple as reducing the scoop size. A study at Stanford found that they could reduce the amount of meat in burritos by 25% without having any negative effect on diner satisfaction. It is important to note, however, that once they got up to a 50% reduction of meat in the burrito, then people started requesting 2 scoops of meat, so that, negated the intervention. So the trick is definitely to find a happy medium. Meat reduction can also include serving blended animal and plant-based proteins, such as blended mushroom and beef burgers, or a spaghetti bolognese with a blend of beef, mushrooms, and walnuts. You can also cut down on the amount of meat served by using smaller bowls and serving utensils, such as tongs and smaller spoons. And you can use this same strategy for reducing consumption of dairy items as well. So instead of having large bowls of cheese and sour cream in a buffet line, for example, you can use small bowls and place them at the end of the line. All right, now let's see what happens when these strategies are put to the test. So in 2024, Greener by Default partnered with Trellis to serve plant-forward menus at their events, including GreenBiz 24 and a few others. And so what we ended up doing is we used a variety of our strategies, such as serving a majority of plant-based options at their buffets, using appetizing titles for their plant-based dishes, and making subtle swaps, such as switching dairy butter with vegan butter for their bread rolls and substituting dairy salad dressings with vinaigrettes. And as a result, we helped them save over 25,000 kilograms of carbon emissions. which is the equivalent to charging over 2 million smartphones or driving 63,000 miles. Another example is the New York Times Climate Forward event in 2024, where GBD provided template language for their registration form, explaining that as part of their commitment to inclusivity and sustainability, all foods served would be plant-based by default, and that guests could request a meat meal if desired. And this led to 80% of attendees sticking with the plant-based default simply by switching the language on the registration form. All right, here are the steps that are typically included when we partner with an event organizer. So we usually start with a menu audit, which involves analyzing the existing menu and finding areas where we can make the largest impact, keeping in mind any goals the organizer might have around carbon reduction, inclusivity, and health. And then once that's done, we usually will share our free culinary resources and best practice guidelines with the caterer and determine if additional culinary support, such as trainings and recipe development, is needed. And then once the scope of work is agreed on, we then help the organizer and caterer implement our strategies and update the menu. And we also usually help build a comms plan to share the organizer's plant forward menu efforts with attendees. And then at the end of the event, we gather data such as the number of meals served and serving sizes to calculate carbon savings. And we can also help measure diner satisfaction and cost savings if desired. And then lastly, I want to mention that separate from these event partnerships, we can also provide workshops and trainings to teach event agencies how to apply these techniques to their client events themselves. Okay, now I'd like to dive in a bit more on the comms planning part of our work. So the big picture here is that, once you've created a plant forward menu, it's really important to share it with attendees. You don't want to spend, all this time creating an amazing plant forward menu and then just leave it up to attendees to figure out. You should make it clear that you're serving plant forward menus and explain the reasoning behind it. Point out that it's an initiative to help reduce your event's carbon footprint, and invite attendees to help by choosing the more sustainable option during mealtimes. And this can also be a really great opportunity to help educate attendees about the link between food and their own carbon footprint. You can do this by, posting fun facts about plant-based food throughout the event and highlighting how much carbon, water, and other resources you can save by eating more plant-based. And on the slide here, you can see some example channels that you can use to promote your efforts and help educate attendees. So this could include things like on-site signage, main stage slides, app notifications, attendee emails, and social media channels. And we always recommend using at least one physical and one digital channel to get the message across and really make sure you're having, a comprehensive communications plan. And here's an example of how a past partner organization, the Harvard Office for Sustainability, has described their plant forward menu for their events. So they said, when hosting events and meetings, the Harvard Office for Sustainability serves plant-based meals by default, giving diners the choice to opt in to meals with animal products. Greener by default is inclusive, reduces our carbon footprint, and increases the healthfulness of meals. And here's another example from Trellis. In partnership with GBD, Trellis is proud to feature an innovative plant-rich menu at this event. Did you know that on average, plant-based foods produce half the carbon emissions of animal-based foods? Your small change can make a big difference. And I really want to emphasize that last part there, talking about, the environmental impact and the benefits of serving plant-based foods. There was a study by WRI that found that environmental messages, such as this, can be one of the most effective in increasing the uptake of plant-based foods. All right, and then lastly, I'd just like to walk you through a couple of examples of how you can turn menus plant forward using these strategies. So take, for example, this breakfast menu, which is a buffet for this example, and let's say we want to use climate-friendly ratios as the main strategy. And as a reminder, that involves serving a majority of plant-based entrees, about 2 plant-based options for every animal-based option. And so here, the main entrees are scrambled eggs and 2 meat options. So for example, instead of having 2 meat options, You could serve a plant-based egg option and a plant-based meat option, such as maybe a just egg breakfast burrito and smoky tempeh bacon. And what this does is it really helps create, a savory, filling meal that's plant-based instead of the only plant-based options being fruit and potatoes, which I know we oftentimes see at events. And I would also make sure some of the pastries are vegan as well as gluten-free and nut-free, and maybe swap the pancakes with oatmeal, which provides a sweeter, plant-based, and gluten-free option for breakfast. So overall, we're really, trying to make the whole menu as inclusive and sustainable as possible. And then here's another example, this time focusing on a lunch buffet. So if we applied the same climate-friendly ratio strategy, again, we would want to make sure that 2 out of the 3 main entrees are plant-based. So for the original menu, we have carne asada, black beans, and chicken mole as the main entrees. And I would replace the carne asada with maybe a plant-based dish high in protein, such as a crispy adobo tofu. And I would definitely make sure that, this plant-based dish has an appetizing title, again, by using descriptors that bring out the flavors and the ingredients. And then for the other entrees, I would likely keep the beans since they're, of course, already plant-based. And I would also keep the chicken as the meat option. And I might just ask the caterer to serve that chicken in smaller pieces instead of full cuts to reduce the uptake of meat. That's part of the meat reduction strategy. And then for the salad, sides, and dessert, I would recommend trying to make those plant-based as well, using the subtle substitution strategy. So again, the entire menu as it is as inclusive and sustainable as possible. And you could do that by swapping dairy cheese and mayo in the elote salad with vegan cheese and mayo, making sure the Mexican rice is cooked with veggie broth instead of chicken broth, and replacing the milk chocolate in the churros with the dark chocolate or just serving regular churros, which are usually plant-based by themselves. And then lastly, I would apply the prime placement strategy to this menu by making sure that the plant-based proteins are placed first and the chicken is placed last. All right, so that marks the end of my presentation. I hope this was valuable and y'all feel inspired to incorporate some of these strategies into your own menus. If you'd like to learn more about our work at GBD, you can visit our website, greenerbydefault.org. And you're also welcome to email me at any time at taylor@greenerbydefault.org. I'm always happy to provide support where I can. So yeah, thanks again for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions y'all might have. I'd also love to know in general, what y'all think about these techniques and if any of them personally resonate with you.